A lot of people don't realize that one F1 team is actually 1,000 people. On the surface, it looks like one person made a mistake in the pit stop, but there's actually a system of things that failed. And this is a practice that is shared across F1 teams, is that they hire for being a good team player rather than being the ultimate best engineer.
So, welcome everyone. This is EODF 2025. We have with us today Jurriaan Kamer, who is the co-founder of Unblock, and also written a couple of books, first one being Formula X, and the second one being the book Unblock, and gave a fantastic presentation this morning about what we can learn from Formula One. And also have with us today Seb Finley from EODF. So, Jurriaan, I'd love to kick off and learn a little bit more about what got you here. Mm-hmm. So, what got you interested in organizations and what got you interested in Formula One, and sort of tell us about the path that's taken you to today.
Yeah, so my background is actually in computer science. I'm an IT engineer from background, and I started working in different management roles over time. So I became obsessed, first of all, with how do we get 100 developers organized in multiple teams, collaborate well together. But then not long thereafter, when I was in roles where I was able to accelerate the digital side of the company, I discovered that the actual biggest bottleneck was not the IT anymore. It was mostly leaders, executives, management, the old way of thinking about top-down structures, governance, that stuff. So I became obsessed with how do we apply some of these agile principles and practices on the management teams. And since then, I've been helping executive teams up their game. And the Formula One thing really started 8 years ago, roughly. As a organization designer, I did go to Spotify, to Apple, to Facebook to look at how they worked, and was super interested in that. But at one point, I was invited to go behind the scenes and actually visit the Red Bull racing factory. And what I saw there just completely blew my mind in terms of the scale and the way of working. So that became a huge source of inspiration, and I started speaking and writing about it, and the rest is history.
Well, there was something that you said right at the end of your presentation, which I think is a great point to sort of pick up the conversation from. Mm-hmm. And apologies if I got this wrong because I wrote it down quickly. You said it's not the best individual that wins races, but the team that works the best together.
Yeah, so F1 teams are and this is a practice that is shared across F1 teams, is that they hire for being a good team player rather than being the ultimate best engineer. They can get the best engineering talent in the world, but if you're not able to work together well with others, then you have no place in an F1 team. It's really the collaboration and the teamwork that makes it work, because a lot of people don't realize that one F1 team is actually 1,000 people. Mm-hmm. So and that group of 1,000 people have to produce 2 cars, and that means there's lots of sub teams, and everything has to connect well together for it to be high performing. Mm-hmm. So that's why this team play is so important.
I'm interested to know, on the counterpoint, what are the things that they don't do? What are the things that you don't see in Formula One teams that might be more commonplace in other types of organizations?
Well, I use this example in the speech as well. When there's a pit stop, it's not like when the car is coming in, somebody will say, let's have a meeting to talk about how we're going to approach this pit stop. No, it's already clear. Like, there's extreme role clarity. They don't waste any time with anything. And that means that in IT you have this concept of technical debt, meaning that if you have a platform and it's not performing well, you're not doing the maintenance that you should, you pay kind of interest on that until you pay it back and you refactor the system. But in my world, there's also organizational debt, which is all the things that we're doing that actually maybe were useful at one day, but actually are very costly, red tape, bureaucracy. And Formula One teams are really good at shaving off organizational debt all the time and just making things as lean and mean as possible.
You talked a lot about the trade-offs, and a lot of these teams are very explicit about that. Tell me more about that.
I mean, so often when you see an organizational strategy or a set of goals, people just stack goals upon goals and goals. And what they, to your question earlier, what they don't do is tell you what they're not going to do instead. It's not so clear sometimes what are we willing to trade off to achieve this future vision, this future goal. So one really helpful way to do it is to articulate the actual trade-offs that you're willing to make. And it's one of my favorite org practices to clarify is even overstatement. So it's one good thing even over another good thing. So in the speech I used the example of consistency even over breaking records. And that was related to the speed of a pit stop. You know, in the session I have a video of a 1.8 second pit stop, which is the world record. But the team wouldn't be happy if they would be constantly breaking that, but also have 5-second pit stops. You know, they want to have consistency, and they'd rather have 2.5 seconds every time than just breaking the world record. And to make this explicit, people know what is the right thing to do, what is the right behavior we should show up with. And if you have those heuristics explicit and you have autonomous teams, that means that teams can make local decisions based on those heuristics that is clear for everyone.
And well, that sort of situation, when I've been in those situations, it's very difficult to write the second half of that sentence. It's really easy for everyone in the room to say, yeah,
quality
we want
even over shitty quality.
You want the good thing over the bad thing. But to have the good thing over the other good thing, writing the second half of that is really, how do you know? And so how do you see an organization can approach writing the second half of that sentence in a way that it's got the right tension, it drives the right sort of behavior, but it's something that's not just a meaningless like quality over bad quality.
Well, first of all, to highlight why it's so important to have another good thing at the second half is because a good even overstatement should be reversible and still make sense. So if you're focused on, I don't know, mobile applications, and you might ignore the desktop as a platform. Well, then that's, you know, mobile even over desktop is a good even overstatement. But desktop even over mobile is a good even overstatement for a different strategy. And then you actually have the trade-off there. Yeah, it's not so easy to write the second half, but it does trigger a really honest conversation about what does it actually mean? What is it that we're not going to do, or what are we going to do less of to achieve this? And maybe, so quality even over speed is an example that we use a lot. But maybe it's not speed. Maybe it's affordability, or maybe it's something else. Like it. So the hard part of it is actually the most valuable part of the conversation, because it kind of forces you to have this conversation about what we're actually trading off.
And I think it really strikes to the values of what are the things that make you unique and make you care about more than other organizations.
So you see these often quite implicitly, because it's not that the whole world is using even overstatements. Like, I wish as an OD designer that it would be true. But there's a lot of principles that are embedded in a company's culture that people kind of understand when they onboard. So I don't know, with Apple, there's secrecy even over transparency. You know, it's a part of their culture. But so you can do this as a company level, but I'm also encouraging teams to do this at a department level or even at a team level. And on a team level, they might be more behavioral. So if I'm working in a team and I'm noticing that we're not giving each other as much feedback as we want, maybe we can adopt the principle of feedback even over comfort. Where it's quite comfortable not to give each other feedback and just walking around the problem every day. But if we really want to lean into feedback, maybe we make that explicit, and that gives the whole group as an agreement the permission to give each other more feedback, because we talked about it, and this is the thing we're trying. And these even overstatements, you can adopt them for 90 days or and revisit them whenever they're not useful. Maybe you want to flip it around. Maybe there was a period where there was way too much feedback and people were like, oh my God, let's stop the feedback for a moment and we just go to comfort over feedback. It's possible.
The first time I saw them was sort of 25 years ago in the Agile Manifesto, and
that's the origin of the inspiration.
And it seems to me that was such a shift in the mechanics of the way that people think about software development. And I think those even overstatements really embodied why and how and what the kind of the people believed in.
They did a great job in that ski area where the developers came together to articulate some of the ideas. They were actually stuck because every person that was invited to the meeting that made the Agile Manifesto were advocating for their own methodology. Like, we should really go for XP and then we should really go for Scrum. And they couldn't get to an agreement of what good looked like. But then somebody would say, well, we all share the same principles. Let's articulate the principles, and then the practices come after. So I think it's a really smart thing they did, for sure.
I'm really interested because McLaren had the good fortune to decide not to hire me once. I went for an interview and I experienced their offices, and I understood that they would ask the engineers to make a desk in McLaren grey as it was then, exactly the right height for each employee. They weren't allowed to have any food on the table, you can't put your coat on the back. And so there was this culture screaming through this engineering organisation. And for me, that, as an OD practitioner, I talk a lot about culture. And so it strikes me there may be a trade-off of this incredibly high performance with a certain flavour of culture. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, McLaren is famous for having a bit of a rigid approach to how they structure their offices. I'm not sure if they're still like that, and maybe they've loosened a little and now are winning world championships. Who knows? It's different at Red Bull, it's different at Ferrari, but what they do share is the attention to detail. I think Toto Wolff, when he was interviewing for the role of team principal at Mercedes, he noticed when he was arriving in the guest area, he saw old coffee cups and he saw the newspaper of 2 days ago lying on the desk, and he made a big deal out of it and saying, you know what, we're not. Every role in the organization has to strive for being the best and being high performant, and that means paying attention to detail, because paying attention to detail is the only way to build up those marginal gains. If you're shaving off milliseconds every day, even if it's really small things, over time they build up. The trade-off is there might be a lot of pressure. It might require lots of discipline, a disciplined way of working. And that's not for everyone, but it is necessary for F1 teams to be able to compete at the front.
And don't get me wrong, I recognise that some people will thrive in that.
But like if the day is the same every day, if you're not distracted, if there's no oil, no spillage, on the tables, I can focus. That's the upside. Yeah, it's like it's an indirect effect, because if the receptionists are thinking about how do we make this environment high performing, then that perpetuates into every aspect, and that ultimately means that the groups that are really doing the work that is making the difference on the track, they will have that culture from the get-go. So it is ingrained into their cultures for sure.
It reminds me of the story of the rock band when they say they want all the blue M&Ms taken out, and it's way down the list, and they instantly can see from the blue M&Ms being taken out that everything else will have been taken care of.
One of the things that you mentioned was around a Formula One team is a learning machine. And so while they're building a physical machine to be able to complete a race as quickly as possible, there's also this organizational machine, and it's not meant to finish a race as quickly as possible, but meant to learn as quickly as possible. Tell us about the role of learning in a high-performing organization.
I mean, Formula One teams they reflect on everything that's happening. They have data feeding into everything they're doing, and it's the only way for them to be constantly looking for improvements. And that doesn't happen automatically. Like lots of leaders are talking about learning organizations, but there's only a very small percentage of organizations that are actually learning as much. And it goes back to another organizational theory of the anti-fragile organization. I made the point of if an organization is experiencing lots of turbulence but has practices to integrate that learning to become stronger, then the paradox is the more turbulence they experience, the stronger they get. So in F1, after a race, the race usually is 90 minutes, a little bit more. They spend over 2 hours reflecting on the race, which is longer than the race itself. And this is happening every time, every race, actually at every team. So over the course of a race week, they have over 50 pre-planned sessions to reflect on what's going on, and all those learnings are captured and feeded into the next cycle. So they're really deliberately, intentionally focus on learning every day.
Which it's quite a contrast to many organizations where the focus is let's not make a mistake. The attitude you talked about there was that turbulence or problems, maybe not mistakes, but that type of chaos is what drives improvement.
I mean, it's a bit of a paradox, but if leaders say we don't want a mistake to happen, which seems like a normal thing to say, but what you then forget is what happens to make the leader's wish come true. You get more steering committees, you get more checks and balances, you get more reporting lines, you get all this red tape. So talking about trade-offs, no mistakes, even over... Now it's like, if you say no mistakes, you're going to get bureaucracy to get there. So it's like, okay, you want no mistakes, but are you then willing to trade off the fact that you're going slower, that you're not innovating as much, people don't take initiative? That's costly as well. So maybe the mistakes is, it's about failure recovery rather than failure avoidance.
It sounds like choosing where to invest, because one of the examples you gave us was a problem in a pit stop where the wheel came loose, and they reflected on the actions of the individual and then went back through supply chain and everything else.
I mean, it's like in the speech I do talk about an incident where it on the surface it looks like one person made a mistake in the pit stop, but there's actually a system of things that failed. And it's like with with plane crashes, you know, there's always multiple factors at play, and it's a human behavior, human tendency to blame one thing or one person to simplify things, but usually it's much more complex. And Formula One learning machines are there to understand the whole system and make multiple corrective actions so that the next time it doesn't happen again.
Does that happen in a similar way in a Formula One team, or is there a different type of approach they'd use?
Well, it is very checklist driven. Okay. So the debrief, they have a checklist they go through every time, because it's just a way to remind them of all the different aspects. So how were the brakes? How was the driving comfort? How was the balance? How were the tires? How was the strategy? And I've talked to a CFO of a big Swiss bank this week actually, where he said like, well, it sounds good to do a postmortem, but we don't have the culture of learning. If we do that, everybody will be covering their behinds. And that's also driven by leadership behavior, because what you want to do is you want to blame the problem and not the person. But that is a culture that needs to be built. So what I told him is like, maybe for you, instead of focusing on the incident and figure out what went wrong, maybe you can go back and talk about what were all the aspects that made us successfully deal with this problem, you know, flip it around and talk more appreciatively about the situation, extracting principles and those kind of things. But yeah, over time, if an organization gets really good at this, people can show up and say, I messed up and I want to talk with you about how I can improve differently, and there will be multiple learnings, and people are just helping the group learn rather than, you know, talking to this individual.
Are you aware of how that might be communicated? Because one of the examples you gave me was that there's around 1,000 people working for a Formula One team. And so you've got this this small group of people at the race. And then this learning and this approach to learning will need to be, it'll need to incorporate that full 1,000. Have you thought of techniques or seen techniques that encourage that? Yeah,
I mean, on the Monday morning debriefs, it's actually the team principal, drivers that are coming from the racetrack that are talking to the whole factory about everything that happened at the race. So first of all, it's very transparent, and this is like, if a driver shows up and admits his mistake, then that actually perpetuates as a culture. There's actually a company that I worked with that has a really fun, interesting ritual to build this culture of speaking up and sharing your failures. Where they also had this monthly all hands meeting, and then one of the senior leaders would dress up like a priest and would go on stage and ask if somebody had a confession to make. And it was this funny thing, and so people laughed, but that kind of lowered the bar for just speaking up and saying it. And they would also always make sure that at least one of the executives from the exec team would say something, and that would kind of perpetuate the constant culture of, we have to innovate here to win, which means there will be failures, so let's talk about our failures and learn from it, you know. So it's something that has to be cultivated. It's definitely not in the default human nature.
It reminds me, one of the organizations I worked for had a big town hall regularly, and the CEO would come on stage with a bottle of red wine, and it was a prize to anyone who could ask him the most difficult question.
Right.
And cool. So it was encouraging this transparency and openness. I think it was a really powerful sort of lead from the top.
You just have to realize that stuff, stuff doesn't happen naturally. You know, if you want to build a certain culture, you have to do work as a leadership team to cultivate that and to build that, because otherwise humans will just drift into a certain corner, which is our default social behavior, and it's not so productive.
I worked once for an organisation where there was a very large operational element, and so the safety culture was paramount, and we would open every single meeting with a safety message. And even now, I've not worked there for a long time, but my friends will laugh at me because I always hold the handrail, and that has been completely ingrained in me.
There was a really a visual which you talked about, but it struck me. You talked about the clock that counted down in the teams where the pits were, that they could see exactly how long until the race started. There was a similar clock back at the headquarters which showed how long until the next race. And it struck me that seeing this clock counting down every day when you were at work and knowing exactly how many hours, minutes and seconds there were until your deadline would sort of drive a certain type of behavior. And similarly, there's quite a physical element to to Formula One that the things that you do are directly very visible and clear in front of you. How do you think that visibility and that you can see exactly the result of your work, how do you think that changes things?
I mean, Formula One teams and any sports team, they have the quote-unquote advantage, but also disadvantage of always knowing exactly how you're performing, because everyone in the world can see it, you know? And there's also extremely clear goal of what the goal is, and you always know like where you stand against your competitors. In business, or any other organization, it's not so clear sometimes, and it really helps to create clarity. So some examples of clients is where when you enter the reception area, it does show like some of the key metrics immediately. And in essence, this clarity of what are the metrics that matter, and making them visible and transparent, but also making them part of the conversation everywhere, is a way for people to get awareness of what really matters here. And in F1, that's clearly lap times, but also making sure the car is ready to race in 2 weeks. So it does drive some behavior, and it creates this sense of urgency, like the show has to go on.
We talk a lot in org design about purpose and connecting people to purpose. Is that ranking, that clock, that performance, is that the purpose? Does that replace purpose in a Formula One organization?
I mean, in F1 teams, it's winning races and winning the championship is the ultimate purpose. And Frank Williams, he died a couple of years ago, but he's the founder of the Williams F1 team. He was famous for always asking the same question whenever somebody came up to him. And the question was, will this make the car go faster? And that question got ingrained into everything they did. So when there was a meeting, then people just started to talk bullshit, and they were like, "Does this conversation make the car go faster? No, let's stop and abandon this and do something else." You know, so it's really about clarity of that and finding different ways to incorporate that in your way of working.
So that purpose to a Formula One fan could be immensely motivating, but to someone who doesn't care much for Formula One, the purpose of winning a race might seem quite frivolous.
Yeah.
Are the people who work in these teams, are they all fans? Is it do people really deeply connect with that purpose?
I think so. I mean, they can source all the talent in the world, especially if you're an engineer or you maybe have an aerospace background. Like it's the pinnacle of motorsport, so they are able to attract massive amounts of talent. They can hire whoever they want. You know, everybody's queuing up. So I'm assuming that the people who work there are kind of connected to this. It is important to note that the purpose for the marketing department of Red Bull Racing is going to be different than the purpose of, you know, so it really depends on your, you know, purpose is fractal. You know, there's an overarching thing that we want to win championships, but at every department level, maybe a team level, you have a different thing you're going after. And to me, it's important that purpose is co-created. So teams kind of figure out in the bigger perspective what is our purpose and what is our strategic intent here. And that's what I also talk about in the book, but also in the presentation about self-alignment and aligned autonomy, where you want to have these autonomous units of experts, specialists that are doing this one thing, give them as much decision authority that you can bear, but then they still have to somehow connect to the wider organization, because everything has to add up to this bigger thing.
And what sort of behaviors should that autonomous team exhibit to make that successful?
Yeah, so transparency, looking outside of the borders. So in terms of alignment, it's important that it doesn't become an insular thing that just goes off and does something. They need to be in communication with the other teams they're depending on or integrating with. And this happens actually in some cases twice a day, where there's a huddle of all the different departments. A representative of each department comes there and they talk about the different challenges that they may have or what's coming up next, and they do this at the end of the day as well. And one thing that struck me is that in business, when you're dependent on another team and you're waiting for them, you might complain and say, you know what, they messed up again, we have to do over hours because they didn't do their job properly. But in F1 it's a very different mindset, because if you're done with the car 2 days before the race, you've lost 2 days of opportunity to make the car faster. So they're pushing against the deadline also to get as much upgrades as possible in there. So people are willing to maybe sometimes take overtime to do the last possible innovation to make sure it actually ships to the race. And some F1 teams are famous for bringing last minute parts on the carry-on luggage of some of the engineers, and they're flying with these huge boxes. There's even a crazy example out there of a car that was ready to go on track. I think they had to drive in Malaysia, and they shipped it from the factory in the UK, but they didn't have time to paint the car yet. So they hired a huge airplane, and they did the paint job during the flight. So it's like this crazy last-minute push to get something on track.
There's also a certain flavour of trust going on there, isn't there? If you've got these autonomous teams where you don't interfere with them.
Yeah, I mean, trust it must be there. That goes up all the way to the driver, who has to trust his equipment. You have to rely on each other for collaboration. Trust needs to be there. Otherwise, you cannot perform as a high-performing team.
It's fascinating you talk about this environment where on the track every second counts, but also back at the office every second counts as well. And so there's how can we make the most of everything that we possibly can to be able to achieve that performance. But we're coming very close to the end of our conversation today. For people that are interested in what you've talked about, the things that you covered in your presentation, the things we've talked about here, what's the best resources for them to learn more about what you're saying or to get in contact?
So I'm quite active on LinkedIn. So if you look up my name, they can go pick up a copy of one of the 2 books, Unblock or Formula X. They're both on Amazon. And let's connect.
Well, thank you very much, Jurriaan. Thank you very much, Seb. It's been a fantastic conversation today, and look forward to hearing more.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.